This is probably the best book that I've been able to find on the question, and it's pretty widely available. I've actually tried to do research to see if there's anything more recent that's been published about this, but I haven't been able to find it. In terms of historical stuff, secondary sources, stuff like that, again, you know, I would go to Wiki and just follow the lead you find there. Ironically, while the United States did not contribute much to the theoretical ideas of early socialism, the actual implementation of these ideas developed more here than anywhere else. Probably because of the extensive undeveloped land areas in the United States. There was plenty of room to try to implement these experiments. Perhaps the best known of these was Brook Farm in Massachusetts, which was a haven for the early abolitionist movement in the 1830s, and was a center of transcendental thought. Brook Farm was immortalized in Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel called The Blithedale Romance, in which he calls, it's really about Brook Farm, which he hung out there, but in the novel he calls it Blithedale. It's fictionalized, and if you read about the transcendentalist Margaret Fuller, and they were into free love and all kinds of stuff. If you read enough about who they were, you can see who he's fictionalizing there. At the same time, there developed a more political tendency within the socialist movement based on the emerging industrial working class, which characterized itself as communist in order to differentiate itself from the less political tendencies of the socialist movement, which again at the time were based on middle class intellectuals. Now, the term communism actually has an older history than the term socialism. Literally, as I said, the idea of socialism comes out of this issue of the social question. Marx talked about primitive communism, which was the way social relationships that existed in hunter-gatherer societies. But of course, they didn't call themselves primitive communists. And then there was a lot of conjecture about whether the early Christianity, first century Christianity, were communist societies. But we actually don't have any secondary sources about Christianity until about the 3rd century. So we don't really know what first century Christianity was all about. But then these sort of monastic societies and that sort of thing are often characterized as communistic because of sharing things and that sort of. But it arises again in the early 19th century as a characterization of this movement, this socialist movement, which is A, political, and B, based in the working class. Probably one of the earliest figures who propounded these ideas and was identified as a communist was Francois Babeuf, who became a martyr of the French Revolution. He was very disturbed that as the revolution began to wind down and became more bureaucratic, and the enthusiasm of the masses had waned, and he came up with this idea, and he actually attempts to overthrow the Directory. He's executed for it, and his group is named the Conspiracy of Equals, and was one of the earliest manifestations of this kind of development. Meanwhile, in the United States, while not explicitly socialist or even socialistic, a group of working class parties called workingmen's parties began to develop in the cities along the eastern seaboard. First in Philadelphia, in New York, and Boston. Ultimately, virtually by 1828, most urban centers in the United States had a working men's party, which was an independent. These were literally the first labor parties in the world ever in human history. Working men's parties flourished throughout the United States, and they called for a wide range of reforms, such as the extension of the franchise, 10-hour workday, free public education, civil service reform, a direct system of election, pensions for Revolutionary War veterans, more equitable taxation, abolition of capital punishment, an end to child labor, and the debtors' prisons. You know, some of these they won, and obviously some of these we're still fighting for. Other aims of the working men's parties included improved housing and working conditions, more adequate sanitation facilities, and provisions for free land. The Working Men's Party was attacked by both the Whigs and the Democrats. The Working Men's Party attacked both the Whig Party and the Democratic Party, which was the second party system, for their lack of interest in labor, and they achieved sizable votes and won office in several municipal elections. Despite their electoral successes, the working men's parties had pretty much died out by the early 1830s. The likely causes of their disappearance included lack of experience in political organization, factional disputes over doctrine and leadership, and the extension of the franchise and incursions by the increasingly pro-democratic Democratic Party. So it's literally the first example of an independent working class party being co-opted by the Democratic Party. This is in the 1830s. It's a very interesting thing. In this period, the popular vote in 1820 was 87,000. And in 1840, the popular vote was roughly 1.25 million. It jumps 15 times in 20 years. Okay. The population in 1820 was about just short of 10 million. In 1840, it was just over 17 million. That is, the population hadn't even doubled, but the vote had increased 15 times. Okay, so how do you explain this? Well, what happened? It was the increase in the franchise. Basically property qualifications were abolished in that period, and this was at a state level. It's the states that are sovereign. States control who can vote and who can't vote, and basically state after state in that 20-year period abolished property qualifications to the point where they were abolished, so that by 1840 every free adult white male citizen, those were all the conditions, but if you met those conditions, you could vote. Prior to 1820, even if you met those conditions, if you were not a person of property, you couldn't vote. So that's what led to the explosion of that. And this is very significant because in Europe, you don't get the extension of the franchise. You don't get the abolition of property qualifications in many European countries until fairly well into the 20th century, until before and even after World War I. This is the political environment in which Marx comes of age. Karl Marx comes of age in the early, mid-1840s. I'm going to make the argument here. This is basically in agreement with Al Draper's thesis in The Two Souls of Socialism, that Marx's great contribution to the socialist movement was not the labor theory of value, was not dialectics, was not historical materialism, was not any of those theoretical contributions with he's credited, and I don't mean to discount them, but I want to focus on something else. That Marx introduces an ideological intersectionality. And in this instance, it's the intersection of socialism and democracy. Marx is the first socialist who brings together socialism and democracy in a single movement through the agency of the working class. That the working class is the agency to bring both socialism and democracy. Marx entered, prior to that, you have somebody, for example, a very good example, somebody like Tom Paine, who was a thoroughgoing radical Democrat, but was not, in any sense, socialist. And then you have somebody like Babu, who we mentioned, who was a hardcore revolutionary socialist, but in no sense a Democrat. And Marx brings these two things together. Marx entered politics as the crusading editor of a newspaper which was the organ of the extreme left of liberal democracy in the industrialized Rhineland, and it soon became the major editorial voice for complete political democracy in Germany. The very first article he published was a polemic in favor of the unqualified freedom of the press from all censorship by the state. At the same time, Marx began to research the socialist ideas current at the time, as well as actual social struggles attendant to the emergence of industrial capitalism. Marx was the first socialist thinker who came to socialism through the struggle for liberal democracy. So this was absolutely key to his views. In working out a point of view that wedded communist ideas with democratic aspirations, Marx and Engels came into conflict with then existing communist sects. Before they joined the group, which became the Communist League, for which they were commissioned to write the Communist Manifesto, they stipulated that the organization, which prior to that time had been a conspiratorial organization, that it abandoned all its conspiratorial aspects and become an open propaganda group. And to quote them, they said, everything conductive to superstitious authoritarianism be struck out of its rules, unquote. And they demanded that the leading executive committee of the organization be voted in by the membership rather than from above. The League was won over to their point of view. They wrote, "We are not among those communists who are out to destroy personal liberty, who wish to turn the world over to one huge barrack or into a gigantic workhouse. There certainly are some communists who, with an ease of conscience, would refuse to countenance personal liberty and would like to shuffle it out of the world because they consider that a hindrance to complete harmony. But we are convinced that in no social order will personal freedom be so assured as in a society based on communal ownership. Let us put our hands to work in order to establish a democratic state wherein each party would be able, by word or in writing, to win a majority to its ideas." The Communist Manifesto, in the document itself, proclaimed that the first object of the revolution was to win the battle for democracy. So that is absolutely key. Shortly after the collapse of the 1848 revolutions, the Communist League split, and putschism, that is the advocacy of the sudden and rapid overthrow of the state by a tiny elite, reasserted itself within the communist movement. But Marx, from before that point and for the rest of his life, took exception to these ideas which came to be known as voluntarism. Basically, Marx says you'll have to go through 15 or 20 or 50 years of civil wars and international wars, not only in order to change the extant conditions, but also in order to change yourselves and render yourselves fit for political domination. This is his program for the working class.
30 minutes.
As opposed to the volunteerists who said, well, you can basically take power any Sunday or you might as well go to sleep. And he really, from this point, he's really challenging these sort of elitist tendencies in the socialist movement. And a lot of later commentators are very confused about this, although H.G. Wells, a lot of people know about H.G. Wells. He was a science fiction writer. He was a Fabian socialist. And he actually argues that Marx had fettered the idea of socialism and democracy. But he's not saying that because he agreed with Marx. He actually saw that as a problem. After the failure of the revolutions of 1848, there was a general retreat of the working class movement, which lasts for about 15 years or so. And then in the mid-1860s, Marx becomes involved in something called the International Workingmen's Association. Following an uprising in Poland in 1863, French and British workers got together to discuss having a closer working relationship. One of the things that they were concerned with was the import of foreign workers as strikebreakers. And they wanted to set up an international organization to alleviate that. And ultimately they bring together a group which is an extremely variegated group. It includes trade unionists, it includes revolutionary socialists, anarchists, communists, and revolutionary nationalists, people like the Italian Mazzini. It's kind of an agglomeration of different radical and revolutionary tendencies. It's not even explicitly socialist, but at its peak, it has over 8 million members all over the world, and so it is quite influential. And this organization goes on through the 1860s and into the 1870s, and then in the early 1870s, there's a war between France and the emerging Prussian Empire, and the Prussian armies are literally at the gates of Paris, and the French armies are at the verge of defeat. And out of this, something that they call the Paris Commune develops. The Paris Commune was a radical socialist and revolutionary government that ruled Paris only for a few months, from March 18th to May 28th, 1871. A lot of Marxists and anarchists, revolutionaries, look to the Paris Commune as like a great high point in the history of revolutionary socialist movement. The communist historian Eric Hobsbawm says that the greatest thing about the Commune was that it existed, that it really didn't have a whole lot of time to do much, and if you actually look at its program, you would, call it sort of a reformist program. They did things like end night work, and fairly modest reforms, but Marx thought it was very interesting, and it really, for a time, it really changed his viewpoint about what a revolutionary government would look like and how it would be different from an existing bourgeois democracy. But just in terms of my evaluation of it, I mean, what he thought was important, in particular, two things that he thought were important. One was what he called the fusing of executive and parliamentary power, legislative and executive power. And the other one was direct and immediate recall of representatives. Well, I don't know. I mean, I really, you know, I looked at that and scratched my head about it. I'm just offering an opinion here. But, I mean, the way he's characterizing, to me, doesn't sound, I mean, it's different than the United States, where you make a big deal of the separation of powers. But it doesn't strike me as being all that different from what we call a parliamentary government, where the executive is drawn out of the parliament. And in terms of direct and immediate recall, well, in 1917, the Russian Revolution comes along, and quite independently, the Soviets decide they want direct immediate recall, and they end up turning over representatives like in less than 24 hours, where people don't even have the chance to implement a program. They basically decided, you know, well, wait a minute, you need a 6-month honeymoon, you know, so that even something like direct immediate recall, while it sounds laudable in principle, when you think about it in practice, it is not without its problems. And I tend to agree with Hobsbawm on this issue that I think the most important thing about the Commune was the fact that it existed. It was a workers' revolution and part of the reason that it comes into existence is because the Prussian army was at the gates of Paris, and basically the Thiers government, the bourgeois government of France, was forced to arm the population of Paris in order to protect the city. And it actually makes a deal with the Prussian government where it disarms, and the Parisian working class refuses to lay down their arms, and it's out of that. And that's another aspect of, I think, where Engels had, in a sense, a more sophisticated understanding of the importance of the Commune, where he says, you know, a worker state, the dictatorship of the proletariat, it's the first time he uses this term is in use, is the armed working class. What's important is that the old administration of state power, the army and the police, have been disarmed, and what's armed is the working class, and that's what's important or unique about the Commune. There's a lot of discussion among Marxist groups that make the argument that, drawn from Marx himself, when Marx is writing about this stuff, he says this fundamentally changes my views about how the transition to socialism will take place. But if you actually look at the history of Marx, his biography and his political behavior, after the Paris Commune, in my evaluation of what Marx looks like, the Paris Commune looks episodic. That basically, from after the collapse of the Paris Commune till not only to his death, but to Engels' death, the whole focus becomes essentially a parliamentary focus, and around the key issue being around the extension of the franchise to the working class. And it's not that he becomes a pacifist or that he celebrates parliamentary action or that sort of thing. It's just that's where working class activity appears to be. And this is extremely important because it emerges first in Germany, but it very rapidly spreads throughout the world. In 1869, followers of, 1863, followers of the German German Revolutionary Socialist Ferdinand Lassalle organized something called the General German Workers' Association. Then in 1869, 6 years later, followers of Marx formed the Social Democratic Workers' Party in Germany. Then 6 years after that, 1875, they merged under something called the Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. They merge. The merger meeting takes place in a town called Goethe, and Marx writes one of his most important essays called A Critique of the Goethe Program, in which he's basically challenging a lot of their organizational premises that is probably the most highly developed exposition of his political strategy, but it should be noted that as critical as that is, and as insightful as that analysis is, ultimately Marx endorses the group. He's for it because he always took the position: where is the working class in motion, and what is it doing? And the job of communists, as he called it, was to be. I mean, this is expelled out in the Communist Manifesto. The job of communists is to identify where the working class is in motion and to be whatever help it can be to help it move forward, to help it understand its position in society and the potentiality that it has to move forward, and it's only in Germany where this movement begins, but it spreads all over Europe and even into the United States. And one of the more interesting things that happens in this period, this is again how definitions change meaning over time, is that it begins to call itself a social democratic movement. Engels in particular is very uncomfortable with this. They're not really socialists. They're not really social democrats. They're really communists. I wish they'd call themselves communists, but they insist on calling themselves social democrats. And well, even though it's a really sloppy term, I mean, I'm paraphrasing pretty close to what he said. This is a really sloppy term. We have to go along with it because that's where their state of mind is. And there's even discussion at the time to change the name of the Communist Manifesto to the Socialist Manifesto. It becomes the way socialists, what had previously been called communists, the way they begin to refer to themselves as socialists or social democrats. This doesn't turn around, change again, until after the Russian Revolution, when there's a split in the Russian Social Democratic Party, and the left wing of that split, called Bolsheviks, which stands for Men in the Majority, in 1919 officially changed their name to communists. And so then the term communism reemerges as meaning something else again, different from, so, but basically from 1889 until 1914, the dominant term for what we would call communist today was social democratic. On July 14th, 1889, which is the 100th anniversary of the storming of the Bastille, the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution, a new socialist international is formed, which lasts from from 1889 until the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Meanwhile, in Germany in particular, between 1878 and 1880, there were laws passed that were explicitly called anti-socialist laws. These were that any grouping or meeting that aimed at the spreading of socialist principles was banned under the anti-socialist laws. But in spite of that, a lot of socialists ran for office as independents, and the party continued to gain adherents, though a lot of its key leaders were under indictment and went into exile. This was absolutely crucial for the development of socialism, particularly in the United States, because one of the things that happens is that in this period, a lot of German socialists in the late 1870s and early 1880s emigrate to the United States, and so the roots and origins of Marxian socialism in the United States are very tied up with the anti-socialist laws in the Prussian Empire, and a lot of people of German socialists emigrating to the United States. Meanwhile, in England, an interesting tendency begins to develop in 1884 called the Fabian Society. And this is an interesting group because it's really the only socialist tendency that develops after Marxism, which is in specific contradiction to Marxism. That is, it's not based in the working class. It doesn't have any interest in the working class. It has no interest in recruiting the working class. It is very, very consciously a middle class tendency. It takes the name Fabian after a reform Caesar, Roman Caesar named Fabius, who favored gradual reform, and they basically initially attached themselves to the Liberal Party until it began to fall apart, and then they essentially reattached themselves to the emerging Labour Party in Britain. And one of the reasons why the Fabian Society was so important is because one of the most important German socialists was somebody named Edward Bernstein. And he became exiled because of the anti-socialist laws. He comes to Great Britain, and he befriends Frederick Engels. And he actually is the executor of Marx's literary estate. And so he's widely considered one of the preeminent Marxists in the world at this time. But he comes very much under the influence of Fabian ideas. And he attempts to recast these ideas in using Marxian language, which was not the case with the Fabians. He writes a book which is literally translated in English as The Premises of Socialism and the Tasks of Social Democracy. The title of that book is mistranslated in English as Evolutionary Socialism. And there's a lot of things that are said that are critical of Engels by socialists who are to his left, but I would argue that the mistranslation of the title of his book is frankly slanderous. That's not, his title was not Evolutionary Socialism. It was something altogether different. Although he is arguing something that really, until the current economic crisis, especially from like the 1950s to the 1970s, seemed quite plausible to people. I mean, certainly when I came into the movement, there was a lot of skepticism about Marx's theory of immiseration. And you see that, obviously, that less and less now, particularly among millennials who have a sense of hopelessness about the economy and that sort of thing. But that certainly was not the case, not just in the United States, but most of the developed world, I'd say from the 1950s to the 1970s. And there was a lot of stuff in that period that was written by people from a Marxist perspective who really took exception to Marx's theory of immiseration, and this was Engels, this was Bernstein's theory that he argued. He said the movement is everything, the goal is nothing. That basically that if we kept getting more and more and more reforms, living wage and Social Security and universal health care and all these sorts of things, that basically the demand for revolution would subside. So that was ultimately this state of mind comes to dominate all of the social democratic parties throughout the world. They still rhetorically talk about revolution, but part of it is that for a lot of the biggest parties, certainly the German party, but this is true all over, they're not Marxist sects. They're mass parties of the working class, and more influential than Marxist theoreticians are the trade union leaders in these groups, who are more worried about the next contract than they are social revolution. And some of them even took exception to Bernstein. He said, "Don't say this stuff. Do it." But you don't need, because that's just going to undermine, the attractiveness of our party is that we tell everybody we're a revolutionary party. But if you tell them that we have this sort of tepid program, that's actually going to be less attractive. But practically, we're a party of reform. In 1872, the remnants of the First International, which we talked about, its offices are moved to New York City. And a few years later, it's on the ropes, but it has local sections all over the United States. And there are also a couple of small socialist parties in several cities based in the working class in the United States. And in 1876, they come together, and there's actually, let's see, one group called the Workingmen's Party of Illinois, one group called the Social Political Workingmen's Society of Cincinnati, one group called the Social Democratic Party of North America, and one group called the International Workingmen's Association. They have a unity convention in July of 1876. They are claiming to represent 3,000 workers. The unity convention that they have is attended by 7 people. They organize the Workingmen's Party of the United States. A year later, they come together in their second convention after the founding convention. Sometimes they call that the first convention. The founding convention is not often called the first convention. They come together a year later, they change their name to the Socialistic Workers' Party. 13 years after that, they drop the ick, and they become the Socialist Workers' Party. And this is really the first socialist party in the United States. Got a little time there. I'm doing well. Better than I thought it would be. I'm basically talking about the American scene now. I talked about the development of mass socialist parties throughout the world, coming out particularly out of the Goethe conference, in which the German Social Democratic Party was formed. Other mass parties began to develop throughout the world. And as I pointed out, this is like the late 1870s that the Socialistic Workers' Party is formed. And then in 1880 and 1881, you get this influx of emigres, Marxist emigres from Germany because of the anti-socialist laws. They all joined the Socialist Party, Socialistic Labor Party, to the point where for several years there's so many Germans in the Socialistic Labor Party that its conventions, the minutes of its conventions are printed in German. This is in the United States. All right. All its papers are German. A few years before his death, Engels comes to visit his comrades in the United States, and he tours them, and they have a typical attitudes about American workers that are very sort of stereotypically typical of German arrogance. You know, American workers are uncultured, they're boorish, they're gutter proles. We're the countrymen of Goethe and Beethoven. And so they saw no need or any point in having even having an English language newspaper. And so after touring the United States, Engels goes back to England, and he sends a two-word telegram back to his comrades in the United States, which I think is a great metaphor for American socialists to this day. Two-word is learn English. There was a debate recently, or a discussion recently between Bhaskar Sankara, who is the editor of Jacobin magazine, and Maria Swart, who is the political director of Democratic Socialists of America. And Bhaskar says, we need to figure out, this is current, I'm talking about something just happened a couple months ago. Bhaskar says, we need to figure out how to build cadre. And Maria says, the first thing we got to do is stop using words like cadre. So I think she was right in that instance. Let me see. Meanwhile, a organization of workers, but not just of workers, and sometimes it's characterized, I think, inappropriately as a prototype industrial union. We'll talk about why it wasn't. It begins to develop at the time, called the Knights of Labor. While it's sometimes characterized as like a prototype industrial union, in a lot of ways it was not a labor organization at all. And it didn't understand itself particularly as a labor organization. It called itself an organization of producers. And as such, it included employers who the Knights considered part of the producing classes, but it excluded bankers, doctors, lawyers, stockholders, prostitutes, pimps, gamblers, liquor manufacturers, all of whom they considered unproductive members of society. Some local affiliates were engaged in militant strikes. The organization actually formally opposed striking for its entire existence. By 1886, roughly 20% of all workers in the United States were members of the Knights of Labor. And at its peak, it involved about 800,000 workers. At this same time, Samuel Gompers he's a cigar maker, and he actually takes exception to the Knights of Labor, not because it was a militant workers' organization, but actually for quite the opposite. That is, that because it was not an explicitly working class organization, he wanted to build a trade union organization. Now, it is true that he did want to exclude unskilled, what characterized as unskilled and semi-skilled workers from the organization, but the question arises of who defines a skill? What constitutes a skill? And it's very much self-conscious. I mean, is bartending a skill? Well, the bartenders thought they were a craft, so they were allowed in Gompers' union. So it's not so much some kind of external definition of what constitutes a craft, but it's sort of the self-consciousness of the people involved. Do they consider what they're doing a craft? And that was the determining factor. Just a quote. This was actually in the preamble of the American Federation of Labor Constitution until it merged with the Congress of Industrial Organizations in 1955. All right, and it said, and this is from Gompers wrote this, and he acknowledges that he got it from the manifesto. A struggle is going on in the nations of the civilized world between oppressors and the oppressed, a struggle between capital and labor, which must grow in intensity from year to year and work disastrous results to the toiling millions of all nations. So this is sort of the position of the AFL when it started, but they're really struggling and they don't know what to do, and they actually call for a general strike. It's actually trying to build the movement, build the organization to begin May 1st, 1886. And the Knights of Labor is divided on the question whether they're supported or not. The ranks of the Knights support it, but the leadership is opposed because they see themselves in direct conflict with the AFL. Shortly before the May 1st deadline, a series of railroad strikes begins to take place. And the center of strike activity is in Chicago. And there's a major strike rally at Haymarket Square in Chicago on May 4th, at which apparently a bomb was thrown and some people were killed and some police were killed. And this becomes legendary as the Haymarket riots, and ultimately becomes an international workers' holiday, May 1st. But the practical consequences of this in the United States are the more or less rapid decline of the Knights and the ascendancy of the American Federation of Labor. For its part, the Socialist Labor Party did attempt to play some role in the existing labor movement, but it really had a very marginal influence in the Knights of Labor. It begins to have a stronger influence in the emerging American Federation of Labor in the 1890s. 1890 is a key year in the history of the Socialist Labor Party and in American socialism, because a man by the name of Daniel DeLeon, who's an immigrant from Curacao.
What is that noise, please? Where's that noise coming from?
I have no idea.
I think it's Dave's foot.
No, I wasn't moving anything. DeLeon, who was an extremely erudite person, he was well versed in history, philosophy, mathematics, and linguistically he had few peers. He was fluent in English, Spanish, German, Dutch, Latin, French, English, and ancient Greek, and he had a reading knowledge of Portuguese, Italian, and modern Greek. He, in 1886, a labor party is formed in New York City, and they run somebody by the name of Henry George for mayor. And this is based, this is a real labor party. It was based on the Central Labor Council of New York. Henry George was a very important self-taught economist in the late 19th century. He wrote a book which was tremendously influential at the time, called Progress and Poverty, in which he develops a theory called single tax theory, which basically that land, because it's finite, is not transferable, and that tax should be based on the land. Some of these ideas are still current today in things like community land trusts, for example, where a tract of land will be owned collectively, and people will buy a house. They own the house, but not the property that the house.
Not the land.
Right, exactly. So called Georgism. This theory still has some currency, but the labor movement and most of what there was of a socialist movement at that point decided to run George for mayor. He didn't win, but he came in second. DeLeon was active in that campaign. At the same time, a man by the name of Edward Bellamy wrote a book called Looking Backward. It's a novel, and I think if you want to read novels, I already mentioned the Blithedale Romance. Looking Backward, it's hard to describe how popular it was. It was the second most popular novel of the 19th century, second only to Uncle Tom's Cabin. If you want to have some sense of what Bellamy was about, go to 2nd and Spring Street, the Bradbury Building, and go look inside. That building is actually built on the ideas of Edward Bellamy. He had a very sort of technocratic and almost militaristic view of socialism. His idea of socialism was modeled pretty much after the United States Army. But again, people didn't particularly interpret his novel in the same way it was interpreted. And there was a tendency to interpret it much more democratically than if you looked at it literally. And it became tremendously popular, and people started what were called nationalist clubs, because he talked about the nationalization of industry. There were over 165 nationalist clubs in the United States. 65 of them were in California. So this is a tremendously popular movement. A friend of Engels, who was kind of a Renaissance Englishman, named William Morris was sort of taken aback by Bellamy's book, and he wrote a kind of answer to it called News from Nowhere, which is a much more bucolic and sort of eco-socialist vision of socialism. But these are very interesting 19th century visions of socialism. The Bellamy clubs, they're also, besides national clubs, they're also called Bellamy clubs, are very influential in the United States, and they become a key component of what ultimately becomes the Socialist Party. Another tendency that's emerging at this time, it really goes back to the end of the Civil War, is the emergence of an independent agrarian party, which ultimately develops in the late 1880s and early 1890s, called the People's Party or the Populist Party. And it is ultimately, in 1896, it's ultimately captured by the William Jennings Bryan's wing of the Democratic Party. But there's a wing of the Populist Party that wants to remain independent. There are also remnants of these nationalist clubs all over the country. Then, in terms of the development of the labor movement, the railroads, the unions in the railroads were very well organized, but they were always independent of the American Federation of Labor. They were called the Railroad Brotherhoods. Conductors were organized, brakemen were organized, firemen were organized, engineers were organized. They were organized into separate craft brotherhoods. Eugene Debs, born and raised in Terre Haute, Indiana, and at this time, in the mid-19th century, there was some question of whether Terre Haute or Chicago would become the main hub in the Midwest for the railroads. And dropping out of high school, Debs becomes involved in the local railroad. He becomes a fireman. He becomes active in the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen local. And he very rapidly rises to become a local officer and then ultimately treasurer. And they didn't have a president. The highest office in the local, in the Brotherhood, was treasurer. He rises to become treasurer. After several strikes in the 1880s are lost, Debs becomes convinced that what is needed is not a craft union of different crafts in the railroad industry, but an industrial union. And he organizes one of the first, besides the miners, one of the first industrial unions in the country called the American Railway Union. In those days, what we would call sleeping cars today were built by a company outside of Chicago called the Pullman Company. The man who owned the company was a man named George Pullman. And they were essentially convertible cars. They had seats in the daytime. When nighttime came, they would open out the seats and they became beds. So you could sleep in the Pullman car overnight. None of the railroads owned Pullman cars. All the Pullman cars were owned by the Pullman Company and leased to the railroads. Ultimately, and all the porters, the people, were mostly African American who changed the seats into beds overnight. And they were mostly African American, and they were all called George, after George Pullman. And ultimately, this is later in our story, but they organized a railroad brotherhood called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which is one of the key organizations in the civil rights movement in the 1950s. But that's much later in our story. In any event, Pullman has a company town. It's called Pullman, right outside of Chicago, and people live in the company stores, in the company houses. They buy from the company stores. They get paid in company script, which can only be used in the company stores. And Pullman cuts their wages. And they go on strike. And there's a American Railway Union convention in Chicago at the time. It's 1894. They go to the convention, to the American Railroad Union convention. They ask for support. Debs is actually opposed to supporting them. He says, you know, your strike is ill-timed, it's going to fail, can't do it. He's actually outvoted in the convention. The convention goes to support him. And
115.
thank you. And so he goes along, he becomes a leader of the strike. And they're trying to figure out, the strike is extremely successful, and it's starting to spread around the country. So they're trying to figure out how to break the strike. Obstruction of the mails is a federal offense, right? And every passenger train at the time, really until the 1970s, has a railway post office on it, which is the car immediately after the coal car. And it's the first car on the train. It's owned by the railroad, but it's completely controlled by the post office department. But there's no railway post offices in Pullman. So they take a mail sack and they throw it on an engine, and the engine tries to pull out of the yard in Pullman. The workers stop it, and Debs, as the leader of the strike, is arrested for obstructing the mails. And he's eventually loses, and he ends up in Woodstock prison. And he gets visited by a German immigrant named Victor Berger, who is the head of the Socialist Party in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And Berger hands him a stack of socialist literature. Debs is in jail, so he reads it. Debs goes into jail, a militant working class leader. He comes out of jail a revolutionary socialist. And but the American Railway Union is a shambles. It's a mess. There's nothing left of it. At its last convention, he comes together with a bunch of utopian socialists who want to buy up land in the state of Washington and set up a socialist commune there. And so he said, well, there's nothing left of the American Railway Union. Let's come together, and we're going to start something called the Social Democracy of America. This is 1898. And they meet a year later, and they manage to brush off the colonizers, they were called. And they get more and more interested in the question of electing someone to public office. And they call themselves the Social Democratic Party. And they run Debs for office for president in 1900. Meanwhile, in the Socialist Labor Party, it begins to split because there's a faction that's extremely doctrinaire and unwilling to cooperate with anybody. And there's another faction that wants to have a relationship with organized labor and that sort of thing under the leadership of a Jewish New York labor lawyer named Morris Hillquit. And this faction of the Socialist Labor Party endorses Debs for president, although it's still part of the Socialist Labor Party. And Debs gets about 90,000 votes, which they weren't expecting even that much. But they were so impressed with it that a year later, this faction, the Socialist Labor Party and the Social Democratic Party, come together in 1901 and organize the Socialist Party of America. It becomes affiliated with the Socialist International, which was organized in 1889, and it's spectacularly successful. It's as successful as the British Labour Party. It's as successful as most socialist parties in the industrialized world, with the possible exception of the German Party. And one of the reasons for the organization of Socialist International in 1889 is that the more conscious sections of the labor movement was more and more conscious of the fact that capitalism was reaching its geographical limits. In 1875, Africa was partitioned. Basically, the European powers divided it up. All right. Once that happened, there was nothing left of the globe to divide up. So the more conscious elements of the labor movement internationally understood, because of that a war between the developed countries was all but inevitable. It was simply a matter of time. And part of the reason for the organization of the International was they talked about this, to organize an international general strike to stop an imperialist war. Unfortunately, it never got to that. What happens, although there have been documents even that were recently discovered, diplomatic documents where top diplomats from around the world were very conscious of this, and talking in the summer of 1914, how can we do an end run around this to overcome any anti-war sentiments in the working class internationally to get this thing rolling. But ultimately, there was a lot of controversy among the various social democratic parties in the world about this. Virtually all of the social democratic parties among the belligerent countries in the world, I'm not talking, it was not universal. It was not among. There are a number of countries that were neutralist, but among the belligerent countries, they supported the war aims of their ruling classes, and they broke with the concept of internationalism. This was particularly important in both the German Party and the French Party, because these were the forces that first went to war. And part of the rationale for this in their respective parties was for the German part, Germany, because of a lot of reforms of Bismarck, had one of the best social security systems in the world in terms of unemployment insurance, compensation, and shorter work week, and health insurance, and all these kinds of things. And so they argued, not so much the Marxist leaders, who actually flipped back and forth on this. And Bernstein, for example, was actually a member of Parliament. First, he votes, against voting for war credits. Then he votes for it. Then he votes against it. So he's flipping back and forth. And ultimately, he breaks with the Social Democratic Party, as does Karl Kautsky, who really the major theoretician, as does Carl Liebknecht. All the Marxist leaders ultimately break with the Social Democratic Party, which is dominated by trade union leaders, and form the independent Social Democratic Party, which is an anti-war party. But they were divided on this, and the dominant tendency in the party was to support the state in the war. And the French party, there was a Jean Jaurès, who was a kind of pacifist leader in the French party. He's assassinated like a month before war breaks out in Europe, which fundamentally undermines the anti-war tendency in the French party. The British Labour Party is pro-war. The Belgian Party, all the parties on the belligerent countries, except for two countries, are pro-war. The two countries where the belligerent states, where the socialist parties are anti-war, the two belligerent states where the socialist parties are anti-war is the United States. The American Socialist Party was anti-war, and Russia. The Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was anti-war, and not just the left faction. Universally, it was anti-war. And we know what happened in Russia with the Russian Revolution. What happens in the United States? The American Socialist Party is really repressed by the state. It never really recovers from that. And the other thing that tends to undermine the American Party, somewhat before that, is a series of so-called progressive reforms. In the teens, 1910, 1912, 1914, there's over 1,000 public officials, elected public officials. And this was not like today, where municipal offices are nonpartisan. Municipal offices were partisan, and they were won, 1,200 of them, by socialists. Almost 80 mayors were socialists. Almost 40 state legislators were members of the Socialist Party. A series of progressive reforms, some of which Sanders is advocating for, actually undermine the Socialist Party. Things like open primaries, for example. Back in those days, the government, the state, did not run primaries. Parties were responsible for the mechanisms used to choose their candidates. It had nothing to do with, and parties were membership organizations. You didn't register for a party. You joined a party and paid your dues. That's how you were a member. All right? Open primaries. One of the things that they did was they made election districts citywide districts. So where a socialist candidate could become a representative in a working class neighborhood, the vote was diluted by making it a citywide district. So state-run primaries, open primaries. Another thing was a city manager form of government. This was a conscious effort to depoliticize municipal governments and to turn them over to what middle-class progressives called the authority of experts. And Victor Berger, again, who was the sort of boss of the Socialist Party in Milwaukee, was very conscious that these efforts, and the progressives said, well, this is to get rid of all those Democratic bosses, all those cigar-smoking bosses and the big city politicians. Berger was very conscious that this was a conscious effort to undermine independent working class politics. So between that effort on the part of the progressives to undermine independent working class politics and the Socialist Party's intransigent opposition to war, and then ultimately a split which leads to the formation of the Communist Party in 1919, those things fundamentally undermine democratic socialism in the United States, from which it was never to recover. Next month, I'm going to talk about the period from really World War I to Occupy.